On the Olympic Peninsula, trails are clear until they aren't. The path is wide enough for two people to walk side by side, packed down by thousands of boots, bordered by moss and ferns that look decorative rather than dangerous. A few steps to the left or right, the ground changes texture, the air changes weight, the trees close in. If you turn around quickly enough, the trail is still visible. If you hesitate, it is not. Every disappearance in this region begins at that line. Karen Sykes did not vanish in a storm. She did not disappear in winter. She did not attempt a dangerous summit. On July 18th, 2010, she drove to the Mount Townsend trailhead in the Olympic Mountains for what was described as a routine solo hike. She was 50 years old, experienced, physically capable, and familiar with hiking alone. Her car was parked properly. Her gear was standard. The weather that day was stable. There was nothing urgent about the outing. Mount Townsend's main trail is defined and visible. It winds through forest before climbing toward open ridgeline. Under canopy, the light dims even in midsummer. Moss layers the branches. Fallen trees create irregular barriers that require stepping around or over. Once you move more than a few yards off the cut trail, the ground becomes uneven and the visual reference of the path disappears almost immediately. Sykes was last known to be on the established trail. When she failed to return home that evening, concern developed quickly. Her vehicle remained at the trailhead. Search and rescue operations began the following morning. Rangers, volunteers, and tracking dogs moved along the trail first, then widened outward. Helicopters surveyed from above. Teams walked in coordinated lines spaced close enough to avoid leaving gaps. They checked steep drainage channels where a fall might carry someone out of sight. They examined areas beneath fallen timber where a person might become trapped or concealed. Nothing was found. Tracking dogs reportedly struggled once off the main trail. Rocky sections and variable wind patterns can interrupt scent. The forest in that region absorbs sound and disrupts direction. Once beyond the packed soil of the maintained path, footprints are inconsistent and often vanish under root systems and leaf cover. Search teams returned repeatedly over days and weeks. No clothing, no pack, no clear disturbance. Months later, skeletal remains were discovered off-trail within the broader search area. The location was not miles beyond the perimeter. It was inside it. Officials did not announce evidence of homicide. Exposure and terrain were considered likely factors. What was never publicly reconstructed was the precise path she took after leaving the defined line of the trail. The deviation required only a short movement, a few steps to the side for privacy, a decision to cut across instead of doubling back, a moment of distraction. Under canopy, distance compresses. Once the visual corridor of the trail is gone, trees repeat in uniform patterns. Slight downward slopes feel like level ground. Small drainage cuts deepen unexpectedly. If a person trips and falls into one of these narrow channels, visibility from above is limited to the angle of approach. Searchers can pass within yards without seeing below lip level. Most hikers who step off trail reorient quickly and return. The Olympic forest does not announce the moment when that return becomes difficult. There is no marker indicating that a threshold has been crossed. There is only repetition of moss, trunk, shadow, and uneven ground. Search reports noted no signs of struggle and no indication that she intentionally left the area entirely. The car remained. There was no confirmed sighting of her exiting the trailhead by road. The environment did not show evidence of external interference. The official explanation rested on misadventure. The unsettling element is not violence. It is scale measured against proximity. The maintained trail is narrow but clear. 5 steps beyond it, that clarity disappears. 10 steps beyond, orientation relies entirely on internal sense. 30 steps beyond, the path may no longer be visible at all. When the remains were located, they were not accompanied by evidence of another person. No weapon, no signs of restraint, no confirmed third-party presence. The forest did not produce answers beyond location. This is where most accounts end. But Karen Sykes was not the first person in the Olympic Peninsula to leave a defined path and fail to return. Search teams returned to the Mount Townsend area repeatedly after Karen Sykes' disappearance, because early search operations are built around probability rather than certainty. The first assumption in any wilderness case is that the missing person remains within a defined radius of the last known point. Teams walk outward in controlled spacing, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, scanning ground level and beneath vegetation. In heavily wooded terrain, searchers are trained to look for color contrast, unnatural shape, or pattern interruption. Clothing, gear, exposed skin, and disturbed brush are typical indicators. In Sykes' case, those indicators were absent during the initial sweeps. The absence did not prove she was outside the search perimeter. It meant only that she was not visible from the angles and paths taken at that time. The Olympic forest complicates visual detection because vertical layers overlap. Ferns obscure ground depressions. Fallen trunks create shadow pockets beneath them. Moss covers surfaces in uniform color, flattening contrast. A person who falls or collapses into a shallow decline can disappear from view within a few feet of level ground. When searchers move along grid lines, their line of sight is influenced by slope and vegetation density. If the terrain dips sharply between 2 ridges, a body may not be visible from either side without direct descent into the cut. These are mechanical limitations of terrain, not extraordinary phenomena, yet they create gaps large enough to conceal a human form. When Sykes' remains were eventually found, investigators examined the immediate area for evidence of injury, animal interference, and signs of third-party involvement. Public statements indicated no confirmed evidence of homicide. The working conclusions centered on misadventure leading to exposure. Hypothermia in mountain environments does not require winter conditions. Even in summer, weather can shift quickly at elevation. Wind chill on exposed ridges combined with perspiration from exertion can lower core temperature. Disorientation is one of the earliest cognitive effects of hypothermia. Individuals may make decisions that appear irrational in hindsight, including leaving known routes in an attempt to shortcut back to perceived safety. The Mount Townsend Trail ascends gradually before opening into more exposed terrain. It is possible that Sykes left the main trail at some point, either to navigate around an obstacle or to explore a side path, and then lost visual contact with the established corridor. Once the forest floor absorbs footprints and landmarks repeat, a circular walking pattern can develop. Studies in wilderness survival have shown that people deprived of clear directional cues often walk in arcs without realizing it. In dense forest, these arcs can tighten until the individual returns to a similar location without recognizing it as such. Search teams rely on scent tracking dogs to compensate for visual limitations. Dogs follow microscopic skin cells and odor molecules left behind. However, scent behaves unpredictably in environments with heavy moisture, variable wind, and uneven ground. Scent can pool in low areas and dissipate on ridges. It can cling to vegetation and then be carried away by rain. Reports from the search indicated that dogs had difficulty maintaining a consistent track once off the packed soil of the main trail. That does not suggest sudden disappearance. It reflects the chemical instability of scent in forest conditions. What remains unresolved is the precise sequence of decisions between the last confirmed sighting and the point where orientation was lost. That interval may have been measured in minutes. It may have involved no dramatic event at all. The threshold between maintained trail and unmanaged forest is narrow. On one side, direction is guided. On the other, direction must be constructed internally. Under canopy, even experienced hikers can misjudge slope and distance because visual depth cues are reduced. Trees of similar size and spacing create repeating patterns that diminish spatial awareness. In Olympic terrain, the shift from defined path to raw ground can occur without conscious recognition of risk. The trail surface changes from compacted soil to soft duff. The corridor narrows. A fallen log blocks the way. A step to the side becomes 2 steps, then 3. Within seconds, the line of the trail may no longer be visible. If the hiker continues forward, rather than retracing immediately, the visual memory of the path degrades quickly. Sound does not carry far under thick canopy. If another hiker calls out from the trail, the voice may not register clearly beyond a short distance. Months after the search concluded, the discovery of remains within the broader perimeter reinforced a difficult truth about this region. The Olympic Peninsula does not require vast distance to conceal someone. It requires only slight deviation combined with terrain complexity. A maintained path suggests safety through structure. The forest beyond it offers no structure at all. At the time of Sykes's disappearance, it was treated as an isolated tragedy, consistent with wilderness risk. There was no immediate suggestion of pattern. The case entered park records alongside other incidents categorized under lost or overdue hikers. Only later, when reviewing additional disappearances within similar environments on the peninsula, does a structural similarity emerge. Each begins with a small movement off a defined route. Each search expands rapidly. Each investigation confronts the same environmental constraints: dense canopy, layered vegetation, irregular slope, and limited visibility. The unsettling aspect is not what happened. It is how little appears to have happened before absence. There was no violent weather front moving in at that hour. No documented confrontation. No sign of mechanical failure or equipment malfunction. The last confirmed phase of her hike was routine. The deviation required no extreme decision. The environment beyond the trail absorbed that deviation without visible trace. Years before Karen Sykes stepped a short distance off the Mount Townsend Trail, another disappearance on the peninsula followed a similar structural shift from defined ground to unmanaged terrain. In September of 1999, 30-year-old Donnie Lee Mays entered the Hoh Rainforest area of Olympic National Park. The Hoh is not alpine, and it is not open forest. It is layered, wet, and enclosed. Annual rainfall exceeds 100 inches. The forest floor is thick with ferns, rotting logs, and root systems that twist across uneven ground. Trails in the Hoh are maintained and visible, but only within their narrow corridor. A few steps beyond that corridor, the undergrowth closes immediately. Mays was last known to be hiking alone. When he failed to return, search operations began with park rangers and local law enforcement coordinating volunteers, dogs, and aerial reconnaissance. The search focused first on established routes and known access points. The Hoh River runs through the rainforest, wide in places and braided into multiple channels in others. Gravel bars shift seasonally. Banks erode from below. In areas where the river bends, the current undercuts the edge of the forest floor. Search teams examined riverbanks, drainage channels, and off-trail depressions where a fall could carry someone out of view. Heavy rainfall during that period complicated tracking efforts. In rainforest terrain, rain does not simply wet the ground, it restructures it. Footprints fill quickly, scent molecules disperse, loose soil collapses inward. A dog that begins tracking on dry morning ground can lose continuity once afternoon rain sets in. Reports from the search indicated difficulty maintaining a consistent scent trail beyond the established path. There was no confirmed evidence of struggle. No confirmed witness placed Mays leaving the park by vehicle. The disappearance did not involve a dramatic cliff face or documented avalanche. It involved a person moving within a dense forest where visibility and reference points diminish almost immediately beyond the trail. Unlike Sykes's case, no confirmed remains associated with Mays were publicly identified in the immediate aftermath. The forest and river system offered plausible explanations that did not require criminal involvement. A misstep near the Hoh River could result in a fall into fast-moving water, cold enough to impair motor control within minutes. A short deviation off-trail could result in progressive disorientation in a landscape where every direction appears similar under canopy. The Hoh does not provide distant landmarks, it provides repetition. Trunks spaced irregularly, moss-covered ground that compresses underfoot, fallen trees that create visual barriers. The structural similarity between the Mount Townsend and Hoh cases lies in that narrow threshold. Both environments contain defined trails that suggest containment. Both shift rapidly from managed corridor to unmanaged density. In each case, the last confirmed presence occurred near that boundary. Search operations expanded quickly and methodically, yet the environment imposed limitations on sight, scent, and access. In rainforest conditions, vertical concealment is significant. Ferns can reach waist height. Fallen timber can stack in layers, creating cavities beneath. If a person falls into one of these cavities, direct overhead view may not reveal them. Search teams move in lines, but terrain forces adjustments that create small gaps. These gaps are often measured in feet, not yards. yet in thick vegetation, feet are enough. When examining Olympic Peninsula disappearances collectively, the recurring element is not spectacle, but compression. The space between trail and raw ground is minimal. The time between visible presence and loss of reference can be measured in minutes. Once reference is lost, recovery depends on probability and grid efficiency against terrain that absorbs visual cues. Neither the Mount Townsend nor the Hoe case required supernatural explanation. Both required only deviation, terrain complexity, and environmental interference with search mechanics. What unsettles observers is not a single catastrophic event, but the quiet consistency of how quickly structure disappears once someone steps beyond it. If you want to deepen this further, the next case can introduce a shift from forest to water, where concealment operates differently, but the threshold from defined space to a managed depth remains the same. In April of 2012, Shelley Mook stood near the edge of Lake Crescent with her husband. Lake Crescent does not resemble the rainforest. It is open, clear, and deceptively calm. The water is deep, over 600 feet in places, and glacially cold year-round. The shoreline is narrow. In some sections, the ground slopes sharply downward beneath the surface. From above, the lake looks transparent and controlled. Beneath that surface, depth drops quickly and light disappears. According to the account given at the time, Mook slipped while walking along the shore and fell into the lake. Her husband reported attempting to save her, but was unable to reach her before she submerged. Emergency responders arrived. Divers searched. Sonar equipment scanned the depths. Lake Crescent is known for preserving objects and bodies for long periods due to its temperature and low nitrogen content. Nothing was immediately recovered. Days passed, weeks passed. The lake remained undisturbed on the surface. The forest along its edge did not change. The turnout where the vehicle had been parked remained visible from the road. Months later, a body surfaced. The condition of the remains led investigators to question the original account. Inconsistencies in statements accumulated. What had been described as a slip and fall was re-examined. Years later, her husband was charged and ultimately convicted of her murder. The lake had concealed both a body and a lie. Lake Crescent introduces a different threshold than forest or trail. There is no gradual shift. The edge is immediate. One step too far and footing disappears. The water is cold enough to shock the body within seconds. Muscle control fails quickly. If pushed, if struck, if disoriented, the margin for correction is almost non-existent. From shore, the surface can close without disturbance. What links this case to the others is not motive, but structure. The final moment occurs at a boundary. Trail to forest, forest to river, shore to depth. In each case, the defined space ends abruptly. An unmanaged space begins without warning. Along the Olympic coast, that boundary appears again in another form. Beaches near Shirshur and Rialto are wide at low tide and narrow to nothing at high tide. Sea stacks rise offshore, bluffs crumble undercut from below. In 2017, a solo hiker was last seen walking alone along a stretch of tidal shoreline. Witnesses placed the individual moving confidently across wet sand. Later, personal belongings were located above the high tide line. no confirmed body was recovered. On that coastline, the tide does not move slowly enough to feel gradual. It advances in increments that seem manageable until they are not. Waves rebound unpredictably from rock formations. A single misjudged step onto algae-covered stone can result in a fall into surf that pulls outward through narrow channels between sea stacks. Once beyond a certain point, visibility from land is broken by rock and curvature. The shoreline conceals as effectively as the forest. Search efforts along the coast involve boats, aircraft, and foot teams scanning drift lines. Currents distribute debris unevenly. Recovery depends on timing, water temperature, and where the body enters the surf. In some cases, nothing returns. Forest, river, lake, tide. 4 structures, 4 edges. In each Olympic Peninsula disappearance, the shift happens at a boundary. The maintained trail suggests order. The lake turnout suggests safety. The beach at low tide suggests openness. The riverbank suggests stability. A few steps alter that assumption. Beyond that line, visibility changes, footing changes, temperature changes, sound changes. Karen Sykes stepped off a trail. Donnie Mays moved beyond a managed path into rainforest density. Shelley Mook crossed the invisible line between shore and depth. A coastal hiker walked from wet sand toward rock and tide. Each transition required minimal movement. None required miles of wilderness. What follows is always the same sequence. A final confirmed sighting in a defined space. A short deviation. Then search teams operating in expanding grids against terrain that does not reveal easily. Months later, discovery, or no discovery at all. The Olympic Peninsula does not need spectacle to create disappearance. It relies on thresholds, defined space, undefined space. The distance between them is small. Once crossed, recovery becomes uncertain. The 4 disappearances do not share a suspect, and they do not unfold in identical terrain, but they share something more precise than coincidence. In each case, the last confirmed moment occurs inside a controlled space. A marked trail with visible direction. A roadside turnout beside a lake. A wide beach at low tide. A known path through rainforest. In each case, the disappearance begins at the instant that structure ends. The Olympic Peninsula is not chaotic wilderness in the abstract. It is segmented. Trails are carved through forest in narrow corridors. Shorelines are passable only during certain tidal windows. Lakes are bordered by gravel pullouts and short walking paths. Rivers run alongside established hiking routes before turning into dense undergrowth. The environment appears manageable because it is partially managed. That management creates a psychological boundary. People move confidently within it. The moment someone steps beyond that boundary, the conditions change without ceremony. Under rainforest canopy, visibility drops to yards and direction becomes internal rather than visual. Along the coast, the tide reverses direction faster than intuition predicts. At Lake Crescent, the shoreline looks gradual until it is not. In the mountains, the trail is clear until it narrows into repetition of tree and slope. The Olympic Peninsula does not escalate danger. It removes reference. In the Sykes case, searchers passed through the area where remains were eventually found. In the Mays case, rainfall and river movement disrupted evidence almost immediately. In the Mook case, the lake concealed both physical evidence and motive until time forced the truth upward. Along the coast, currents decide whether anything returns at all. These are not dramatic failures of investigation. They are functions of terrain that absorbs small deviations and enlarges them. The unsettling pattern is not that people vanish into endless wilderness. It is that they vanish close to where they began. The shift is measured in steps, not miles. A few yards off trail, a short descent toward water, a brief movement away from companions. The disappearance does not require prolonged wandering. It requires only crossing the line between maintained and unmaintained space. The forest does not signal when that line has been crossed. There is no audible change. The same trees continue, the same moss hangs, the same air moves through branches. The lake surface remains flat from a distance. The beach looks unchanged until water reaches the rock you are standing on. By the time awareness shifts, the defined path may no longer be visible. Search operations begin quickly on the peninsula because access roads and small towns sit close to these environments. Rangers are accustomed to lost hikers. Volunteers respond in numbers. Aircraft scan ridges and shoreline, yet the terrain interferes with certainty. Dense undergrowth disrupts sight lines. Water absorbs scent and evidence. Vertical drops conceal from horizontal approach. A person can be within the search grid and remain unseen. Across decades, the Olympic Peninsula records these incidents without altering its shape. Trails are maintained, warning signs are posted, tide charts are printed, weather advisories are issued. The boundary remains thin. It always has been. The difference between defined space and raw terrain is often a single step. There is no single explanation that binds these cases together beyond geography. Some end in recovery, some end in conviction, some end in open files. The common element is not motive, it is threshold. Each person moved from a controlled corridor into an unmanaged environment that does not forgive minor miscalculations. The forest does not widen to reveal a lost hiker. The lake does not release what it holds until conditions change. The tide does not pause. The Olympic Peninsula remains one of the most visited and photographed landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. It offers rainforest, mountain and ocean within a single day's drive. Most who enter leave without incident. A small number do not. In each case, the last clear moment occurs before the boundary is crossed. After that, there is only terrain, defined space, undefined space. The distance between them is small, and once crossed, it does not always give back what it takes.